who is the government of South Korea? Currently, the PPP has the president, that's the more conservative party, but the DPK, which is the left-wing party, has a majority of seats. There is an election in South Korea in 2 days. The Liberal Party is scheduled to win enormously for 3 reasons. Firstly, the PPP did a coup. That was pretty bad, it was pretty unprecedented, got a huge amount of coverage, and was enormously tied to their party. Secondly, the opposition leader, Kim Moon-soo, is incredibly popular, he's been in the government for quite a while. Thirdly, high inflation in the past years has created a whole lot of anger and animosity against the government. 2 implications of this context. Firstly, you are likely to get a very, very bad deal by working with actors, for example, like Trump, for the reason that Trump has openly said he enormously loves and supports Yoon Suk-yeol, that he does not want to work with the DPK, the left-wing party. That party has openly critiqued him, which is why it is unlikely you're going to be able to navigate any other deal. But secondly, the DPK party has already called for things like the moving and manufacturing of ties to China to become closer. Leader Kim Moon-soo lived in China for more than 20 years, has worked with them extensively, understands how to navigate that relationship. Not only does that create incentives to try and do it well, it also creates a very strong capacity to be able to negotiate that to a high degree. Second bit of setup, what does it mean for the South Korean government to become closer to China? Obviously, this is a debate we have fiat. We think it falls along 3 broad lines. We'll let the best bureaucrats in the world deliberate exactly how they do it, but it looks like 3 things. Firstly, things like more free trade agreements, trilateral agreements that already exist with China and Japan working together with South Korea, but those things South Korea would invest more money in, we're trying to ensure that they exist to a large degree. Secondly, active diplomatic cooperation. Things like dealing with the fishing that China does in South Korean waters, saying that in a lot of cases it's okay and willing to sacrifice that such that you get ability to sell your goods in China. But thirdly, the intermingling of firms working together in China and South Korea. Often, in a lot of cases, the South Korean government actively tells its citizens to not buy manufacturing goods from China and not have those goods filter through and be a part of that government. This has worked extensively well when countries like Vietnam have engaged in work with China. We think it looks a lot like that, being able to tell Chinese manufacturing they can move their goods through South Korea, rather than being oppositional, rather than banning them. In a lot of ways, South Korea is actively regulated against Chinese firms. They're not even competing against South Korean firms, just as a measure of that animosity. We're going to make 2 arguments. Firstly, this is incredibly good economically. Secondly, this allows for better relationships, both in the Asian region, but particularly with North Korea. Firstly, in terms of the economic argument. The first part of this argument is the specific benefits China provides as currently the largest trading partner of South Korea that comprises about 25% of their trade. Firstly, China sells goods that South Korea requires. Stuff like input goods, so batteries, falling edge chips, and currently the PPP has refused to buy these goods even though they are good for South Korean firms as a measure of standing strong against China and trying to show their strength. This is actively very, very bad for a lot of South Korean firms like Hyundai and Kia that have actually called for these things to be repealed because they want cheaper goods that are better. But secondly, it specifically helps South Korea transition to a more service-based economy because the comparative advantage that South Korea has over China is they have far better manufacturing labor to be able to make very high quality goods. Which is why, if South Korea is competing against China on that, they will be better. And what South Korea can do under this policy is tell China they can be a part of their supply chain in sending goods to America, because South Korea obviously has a fine-ish relationship with America and can be a part of that supply chain. Secondly, Korea, in a lot of ways, exports goods that China wants, and when they're able to sell these goods to China, absent of things like tariffs, having more free trade agreements, having subsidies, and being able to subsidize those things, that is very, very good for South Korean firms. What does that look like? 2 things. Broadly, steel. South Korea has a very, very strong steel refining and manufacturing industry. China obviously needs all of those goods in order to mass produce things like BYD cars. This would be an enormous, enormous industry that South Korea is able to create. Currently, the problem is the South Korean government is actively not able to subsidize those things because they have not leveraged that, they have not worked through that relationship with China, who's told them not to subsidize them. I think as a part of these free trade agreements, that would be what is suggested. Fourthly, they are particularly close, just geographically, which means it is cheaper to sell things. There is an ability to manufacture in a way that is cheaper than anyone else. Second part of this argument, why do you get a good deal? I'm going to start by explaining why comparable deals that you could do with other actors are likely to be bad. I'll start by explaining why the United States in particular is a pretty bad actor, particularly currently. Setting aside the obvious empirical example as established at the top of this speech, which is that South Korea is not going to be able to work with them in the future. There are 3 extra reasons as to why the USA is likely to be a bad actor. Firstly, they're extensively unreliable. That is, they have flip-flopped as to whether or not they will impose tariffs. They've flip-flopped on imposing tariffs on their closest allies. Australia had a perfect relationship with the United States for hundreds of years, and they did not care about it. And it is likely that those things are going to continue rather than flood away. Because in the majority of instances, the United States is moving more towards extreme radical. On either side, the Democrats are looking weaker than they ever have been. I don't think that you can reliably, for sure, know that you're going to be able to negotiate a good deal. Secondly, the United States has already called for, under Biden, things that were very bad for South Korea. Stuff like the devaluation of the yuan, stuff like automotive tariffs placed on South Korean goods to protect American manufacturing. And the core problem here is that the United States and South Korea manufacture the same type of stuff. Both of them sell refined, high-quality goods for consumers that are very wealthy. China manufactures low-quality goods at a mass production angle, which is why they need South Korean high-quality labor, South Korean high-quality planning, South Korean steel in order to get those things off the ground. The United States is a particularly bad actor for those reasons. But thirdly, China has far more incentive to try and keep the region stable because they live there, right? The United States doesn't have to deal with that. They're fine with conflict going on because if conflict goes on that damages both China and South Korea, the United States doesn't care. Because they care far more about harming China than they do about benefiting South Korea. Second part of why you get a good deal is that you can play these deals off against one another. So even if they suggest that it is fine to have some sort of deal, it is better when you have a deal on the table with China to then go to the United States and say, these are the concessions we've got. Can you do any better for us? And thirdly, in a lot of ways, these deals aren't mutually exclusive. Vietnam both has deals with China and with America, and they're able to negotiate that and play that off well. Few impacts of this argument. Firstly, there is far less military threat in this region when you are closely working with China. The reason this is true is simply because when these two countries trade more with one another, firstly, you increase the sort of soft diplomacy that happens. The average consumers that see China far more, the average interaction between firms likely call their South Korean counterpart, their Chinese counterpart day to day, and you increase the economic cost of engaging in conflict. Because now, not only are you engaging in active war, you also are resigning a whole heap of your economy. Or you are not, it gives South Korea the power to restrain China's war machine because you are selling them the steel they require to go into perpetual war into the future. Once you've created that reliance, you create far less military threat into the future, which is extensively important, and I would say is probably an enormous priority of the South Korean government that has cared very much about this for 30 years, that has had to negotiate with this. But secondly, it just makes things far, far better for you as a government in terms of making things better for people, making goods cheaper for average people on the ground. Maybe it is the case that some South Korean firms are likely a bit pissed off by this, but many have been pissed off by the inaction of the government. They've wanted to see more input goods, they've wanted to help them. But thirdly, I think most importantly, this is where the South Korean economy is going. They're going towards manufacturing more high quality goods, and it is better in those cases. That is why it's clearly better for the economy. I'll lastly talk about why this creates a better relationship with China in a diplomatic sense. I'll start by explaining China is the key relationship that South Korea has with North Korea, in that China funds them, gives them a whole host of power. When you are more diplomatically active, you can use China as the negotiator in that area, and it's better when you have control over them and they're not oppositional to you. That is something in South Korea, on all sides of politics and all citizens care about. That is something only Affirmative can like.
Three parts of the speech. Firstly on trade, secondly on the domestic impact, and then finally a little bit on security. Firstly on trade, I think this team makes two generically sounding okay arguments that are incredibly unspecific and don't work. The first is that you sell the same goods or you create the same goods as China, which makes them a suboptimal trading partner. This is only true if you cover them all with the net label of technology and forget that different kinds of technology require different manufacturing skill sets and different levels of infrastructure around manufacturing. The types of technology that China and South Korea trade, or that South Korea produce, are different. For example, China has a lot of battery technology that South Korea doesn't have access to. South Korea has a much smaller EV market. So trading more of those batteries with South Korea would massively benefit the domestic car manufacturing companies in South Korea. Other things, for example, like the South Korea produces, the primary export of South Korea towards China is actually broadcasting accessories, like stuff produced by Samsung, which China doesn't have as large of a market in and largely imports from South Korea. Also other things like integrated circuits, which are different from the type of chips that China produces. They're just specialized in different kinds of technology, and trading with each other enables them to produce both those different kinds of technology better and unlock efficiencies in upstream industries. For example, in the selling of cars or the selling of boats through the manufacturing of steel, etc. So it's not clear that those goods are actually the same, which is kind of self-evident from the fact that they trade in the first place, right? Because if it were true that these two countries produce all of the same goods, why is it that South Korea's largest trading partner is China in the first place? Why are 25% of all the South Korean imports and exports coming from China? Clearly it's because there are some goods that China has that South Korea wants, and there are some goods that South Korea has that China wants. Otherwise that trade wouldn't exist in the first place. This needs to negate reality if they want to make that argument further. The next claim is that, well, you look desperate and weak, so therefore you will be bad at making a trade deal. I think this argument is like virtually entirely rhetoric. For starters, this is not like a entirely new thing, right? Like in 2017, there was a massive collapse in trade relationships between South Korea and China. The reason was because South Korea started deploying a larger nuclear arsenal in order to create better defense against North Korea, and the result was a campaign of ill will and displeasure towards South Korea from Chinese state media. When that happened, the outcome was a 52% drop in sales of Kia Motors and Hyundai internationally as a result of Chinese consumers boycotting them because of information from Chinese state media. Ever since then, there has been a strong and resilient effort to recover that relationship. There was an official repeal of the unofficial state boycott from China and an ongoing building of trust and goodwill between the two countries, which has resulted in a return to trade, which, as I mentioned, is now 25% of total trade from South Korea. So clearly, this is not something that makes you look desperate. It's part of a long-standing campaign of South Korea to do what is in its clear economic best interest. But additionally, they're like, well, you're a new government, so you don't know how to make trade relationships, which is also a pretty silly argument because the diplomats don't change when the government changes, and the diplomats are the one who negotiate the trade relationship. There is a huge government bureaucratic infrastructure to help in the building of trade relationships, to make continuity exist, which is the way that all governments function, which makes the trade deal fairly worthwhile. Why then, let's talk about the second component of this question, just separate from the relationship with China. How does this affect the relationship with the US? Their claim here is that, well, there's a trade-off between trading with China and trading with the US, because trading with China is antagonistic to the US, which makes them pull out. The first thing I'm going to do is try and explain why that trade-off either doesn't exist or is far weaker than this team claims that it should be. There are a few reasons. Firstly, you trade different goods with China than you trade with the US. You mainly take input goods like circuits and like batteries from China. And from the US, you largely sell things like cars and steel, which mean that you don't actually change your trade with the US when you choose to trade with China. You're more likely taking trade away from other Southeast Asian countries or Northeast Asian countries like Japan when you choose to trade more with China. So it's unclear what the real economic impact of an increased trade relationship with China looks like. But secondly, you probably wouldn't do this in an escalatory way. So for example, we'd be selective about the way that we increase our relationship with China. For instance, we would never do something like allow a Chinese military base on South Korea in proximity to US military bases, because that would be obviously against our interests. We would do other forms of goodwill building, for example, like encouraging the joint relationship building of our consumer bases, encouraging each other to purchase goods from each other's markets and trade more, or for example, the establishment of free trade deals in ways that are mutually productive. The third thing to point out is that it's unclear that the tariffs that you get changes on either side. The original Trump tariffs were actually entirely uncorrelated with the relationship between the US and any of its partners. Australia, for example, received a tariff. The UK received a tariff. Both countries that have extensive security relationships with the United States and have been on board with the security regime for the better part of a century, it's unclear that the tariffs are related in any meaningful way towards those kinds of things. And importantly, since the tariffs were based on the trade deficit between the US and other countries, if you don't change your trade deficit with the US, since you aren't actually meaningfully changing which goods you trade with the US, you don't change the incentive that Trump has to tariff you. But finally, it's unclear that Trump's tariffs are even enforceable. Like, they were recently halted temporarily by a court who decided it wasn't in the executive's authority to implement these tariffs. I lost the grand final of this tournament last year on that claim. And yes, they've been temporarily reinstated by the Supreme Court, but it's unclear the Supreme Court is going to make a different decision in the end. Like, yes, there's a conservative majority of the Supreme Court, but the underlying court that made the first decision overwhelmingly ruled in favor of pausing the tariffs, and that also had a conservative majority on it. And it's pretty clearly like against the reading of the Constitution. Like, the executive authorities of the president are to do things or adjust things that are already within the powers of branches of government, which does not include compelling companies to make an extra tax. Taxation is clearly a force that lies in Congress, so something that's unlikely to be long-standing, to stand in the long term. Even if you do believe there's a trade-off between the US and China, why is that fine? Firstly, I think it's probably good in the long run to decouple the relationship between the US and China, like between the US and South Korea. Like, if their argument is, well, the US is volatile, so you must stick close to them to prevent them from being even more volatile, kind of a ridiculous argument, because surely maybe in the short run you have like a year of worse trade whilst you transition some of that trade you previously got from the US towards other countries like the European Union or Australia or other neighboring countries. But in the long run, that's clearly a superior strategy. Secondly, China is a superior partner to the US in a variety of ways that we describe. They have a larger population, they provide you with good inputs that enable the rest of your export economy, and they're far closer to you. So if this team's claim is you get some tariffs, which hurts your export market, trading more with China makes up for that, because it makes your export economy stronger by giving you the input materials that you need to build up your robust domestic industries to then export to other countries. So whilst there isn't a trade-off in terms of what you trade, it does fix the problems of what you trade. And finally, you don't also want China to hate you. Like, if the counterfactual is that you stop this effort to like build back goodwill with China, you also incur damages in that sense, right? Like, look at 2017 when sales plummeted by 50% because of a negative relationship with China. Clearly, in this tension, you want to be making goodwill with both sides and building a good relationship with both countries, something I think you can probably do. What does this look like then? Firstly, building consumer goodwill, so you purchase more goods from each other, but also really importantly, tourism. Because Chinese tourists right now primarily travel domestically. This would encourage them more to go to countries like South Korea. Looks like economic cooperation. For example, China plays an important role in enforcing the fishing economic exclusive zone in South Korea, preventing Chinese vessels from shipping in South Korean waters, which they won't do if you have a negative relationship with them. It also looks like making more free trade deals. The reason why this analysis is important is all these things are mutually beneficial, so it's not contingent on you bargaining with China to encourage them to incur harm. You're doing something that's in both your benefits. On the domestic impact, I think this argument is also a little bit ridiculous. Like, it creates distrust in democracy. Australia's largest trading partner is China. Doesn't give China automatic control over our government. Let's say people in South Korea don't like China. Well, that's a good reason to try and build goodwill, because your citizens racially disliking another country, artificially making your trade with them lower than it should be on an economically rational basis, is unproductive. And trying to undo that by building goodwill through state media is an extremely efficient way to fix that. Very proud of it.
This team has two strategies to win this debate. Firstly, they say that this would be such an unpopular policy both domestically and in the United States, such that it would lead to extreme retaliation. Or alternatively, they say that too much trade with China is a bad thing because Korea needs to pursue a policy of protection from disrespecting China. Firstly, on the question of retaliation, the observation I make at the top of this speech is a huge amount of that material is relying on South Korea doing this in a stupid and self-defeating way, such as ceding a large amount of claims to China in the LOC, or letting cheap Chinese consumer goods flood into Korean markets. But that is not a claim that they prove. We explain, for instance, that we have fiat. We will do this in sensible ways that are moderated and that are useful for the increasing economic cooperation between South Korea and China. That's things like increasing diplomatic summits, like expanding the trade agreements that already exist, like strengthening existing cooperation on things like fishing, and most importantly, avoiding things like the campaign of ill will that China pursued with regard to its consumers purchasing South Korean goods in 2016, or other similar incidents that followed after clashes in the LOC. So, I don't think the claims about retaliation should be weighed that highly in the debate. Now I'm going to talk about, I'll come back to that later, but now I want to talk more about the economy. The observation I would make at this is in terms of the weighting, having a stronger economic relationship with China is far more important than with the US, even if you believe there is a trade-off, which is not something they have proven sufficiently. Firstly, simply a smaller proportion of South Korea's trade is with the US compared to China. 25% of all South Korean trade is with China. And And increasingly, and importantly, the share of trade with the United States is diminishing, both because the US is becoming more protectionist, both right now, but also generally. So their claim that you can just wait it out until the Democrats get back in doesn't work, because even under Biden, they imposed massive export restrictions on things like the United States, like high-tech US things, and other sorts of policies to pull manufacturing and, for instance, the automotive industry back to the US. But additionally, as South Korea continues to grow economically, its manufacturing and service sectors continue to grow, it's becoming increasingly similar to the United States. This team, I think, is they try to pull a trick on you by arguing that China's economy is more similar to South Korea than South Korea's is to the US, but that is obviously an absurd claim. China is a country that to this day is far, far poorer than South Korea. South Korea began developing and growing economically and developing industry multiple decades prior to China. It invested in industry far earlier. They say China is very educated. The educational gap between China and South Korea is far greater than South Korea and the United States. South Korea is a country where nearly everyone goes to university. That is not the case in China, for instance. So, the proportion of trade that South Korea does with China is diminishing. But secondly, the US is becoming less economically relevant. It's abandoned the World Trade Organization. Europe is pivoting to Asia and doing more deals there as well. The United States dollar is under threat as a global reserve currency. It's increasingly becoming unimportant. But the third note I would make here is every single one of their claims about the economy is reliant on the idea that there is a trade-off. But we explained that it is possible to develop both relationships and that the trade-off of trading with China is not large. Firstly, South Korea can do what Vietnam is doing, for instance, by importing input goods from China, then using them to do South Korean manufacturing and exporting those goods to the US, which is, for instance, what already happens with cars. China is very good at manufacturing batteries. The largest Chinese battery manufacturer, CATL, recently had one of the biggest IPOs of the last few years. South Korea does not have a domestic battery manufacturing industry. It makes far more economic sense for them to purchase the batteries from China as opposed to, for instance, investing trillions of dollars to make batteries less efficiently and more expensively than China does. Then they can use those batteries in South Korean technology, which US consumers will buy. But secondly, it is also possible to play both the US and China against each other. And more trade with China, I think, makes the US more likely to do things like investment in South Korea, to maintain them as an ally, especially under the Democrats. But particularly, Trump still fashions himself as a deal maker. Although he's doing the Liberation Day tariffs, he has been flying around the world to negotiate trade deals to come to a resolution. That is precisely the sort of thing he is likely to do with South Korea, as for instance he has been doing in the Middle East. But, I don't know, all of their analysis is contingent on the US punishing you if you trade with China, but the opposite not being true. However, if you shirk China as they want to do, obviously China will punish you, and for the way I explained earlier, that's a far bigger harm than, for instance, any retaliation from the US. Both because Charlie gives you a large amount of mitigation to suggest why the tariffs imposed by the US are either unlikely to occur or are simply not economically as devastating. However, China, firstly, has punished you before, for instance, as they did in 2016. Secondly, they also currently have a desire to go tit for tat with the US in terms of tariffs. So, in the same way that the US wants to disincentivize people from trading with China, China is a country who wants to do the same. So if South Korea is deepening its economic ties with the US, China is very willing to pursue that against South Korea as well. But thirdly, if this team is correct that South Korea and China are so similar economically and are competitors, that's why there is the greatest rational incentive for China to apply tariffs to South Korea to prevent, for instance, South Korean manufacturing from outcompeting or China from competing against Chinese firms. So, China is likely to punish you even under their side. And then the question is what way, which I've already dealt with. However, their final sort of series of claims on the economy is irrespective of everything else, it's just not good to trade too much with China because they'll outcompete you. And I would think most of these claims here are absurd. The first thing they say is Chinese consumption is weak. Yes, that is true, but South Korea is primarily not selling consumer goods to China. They are selling things like input goods for Chinese manufacturing, things like steel. And this thing says China produces its own steel. You can pull up the Organization for Economic Development website. One of South Korea's major export to China is steel. Like, this is just true. But additionally, as South Korea continues to grow, it is transitioning to a services economy, which is something that has a unique ability to provide to China, and is very well positioned to. Chinese consumers, for instance, are far more likely to be willing to purchase services from South Korea than it would be, for instance, from the West. So there are a large number of things you can sell to China even if domestic consumption is weak. Then they say, well, China does a lot of high-tech manufacturing, so you're competing against them. But importantly, as I've already explained, Korea does just do empirically more. It is more educated. It has invested in innovation in the long run. They say, well, China has a lot of cheap labor, which is why they do high-tech manufacturing. If you have a lot of cheap labor, that's why you do low-tech, labor-intensive manufacturing, as opposed to, for instance, doing things like innovation or entrepreneurship. But secondly, they do have different strengths. I'm so confused by this team who seem to think that South Korea has a large battery or AI industry. They simply do not. Those are the techs that China is a world leader in, and those are important inputs that not that South Korean consumers buy or even that they could counterfactually produce domestically, but increased productivity in South Korean businesses. For instance, artificial intelligence making South Korean service providers more efficient, or batteries improving South Korean manufacturing. Then at Bennett, they say, oh, well, if it's so good, if you really need the batteries, why do you not do it now? Why would South Korea ever refuse to buy the batteries from China? Firstly, this falls into the problem of what we've already explained, which is there is a large amount of mutual ill will between these two countries, and China will punish you if you do not deepen your relation with them. But it's a question of Chinese sentiment towards South Korea. So it's not that South Korea wouldn't want to buy the Chinese batteries, it's that China would be hesitant to let its large battery manufacturers sell goods to a close United States ally, and an ally that is becoming closer under their side. Honda is also a Japanese firm, by the way. They are not a chaebol. The final thing that they say is that China produces a lot of cheap consumer goods and you wouldn't want them to flood the South Korean markets. Firstly, that is a good thing. That means South Koreans have more access to cheap goods that they don't produce. The types of things that South Koreans produce aren't things like clothing or low technology. You need to buy that from someone. It's far better to be able to buy that from China without it being tariffed. But to the extent that they do compete, Koreans have a strong national preference to buy Korean goods, which is why South Koreans will never start buying BYD instead of Honda or Kia. Finally, on domestic politics, they say it will be unpopular among South Koreans, but it's a public policy of Kim Moon-soon, who's about to win the election by a landslide. It is simply not that unpopular.
Please go. The problem with this debate is that it has already happened. Vietnam, a country which produces a far more analogous set of goods to China, signed a pact formally selling goods almost exclusively to China, skirting the US's tariff policy, and the US responded by trying to offer them a better deal. And at the time, Vietnam was trading with the United States with popular support, a country which literally invaded them 30 years ago and butchered the vast majority of their civilians. They did not care because it made them richer. I'll start by talking about the economy. And the first question to unpack here is, how is trade done? Because the Hail Mary we get at third day is things are already done in terms of trade. This nukes their case in two ways. Firstly, their case is if a free trade agreement would happen, it would just invoke a huge degree of retaliation. Trump would kill them. The question you should ask yourself is, if they concede that all of this already has been done, how many of the harms they say and assure would happen have actually eventuated? But secondly, this claim is contingent on the South Korean government imposing sanctions and not trading with China rationally. They rationally would have protected everything that is already imported. But the fabric of their case is that the South Korean government irrationally hates China so much they would never work with them. That explains why they aren't smart in terms of protecting industries that actually matter to them. Their claims about the South Korean government being controlled by chaebols actually explain why they wouldn't care about the people that exist there. Secondly, they established that the problem with South Korea is they have a very weak consumer base with low demand. That hurts their case because it explains why China isn't concerned with prying away a few shrinking amount of South Korean consumers, because all of their harms are to do with Chinese firms trying to come in and grab the consumers that exist. We explained to no response as they concede this consumer base is small, and then at Jack that this is a consumer base that probably already picks South Korean goods because they have national reasons to do so, which is why their claims, which are contingent on Korean firms being flooded out, are not proven, are not eventuated. They have not explained it there. What we explained this looks like down the bench. Firstly, at first affirmative, is that South Korea does have huge amounts of manufacturing that China can't do. They manufacture things like telecoms that China would rely on for a lot of people. They have manufactured things like Samsung screens that are the best in the world, and they could subsidize these things more if they negotiated a deal which would in fact allow them to. But secondly, as we tell you at Charlie, often what China actually wants is an ability to have an intermediary country they can sell through to the United States to get around tariffs. Which is why what their case is contingent upon, which is China just selling goods and crowding out South Korea, won't occur because China wants to sell goods to South Korea to be brought on to the United States in the same way they have done with a bunch of other countries. And as they can see, South Korea has a good relationship with the US. But lastly, as we explained, China is just a better market for a variety of reasons that they can see. Firstly, that China is a far more growing market that is becoming richer. That is exactly why it is better to care about the billions of people that are becoming more wealthy by the day. But then secondly, if you're talking about which market is more analogous, the United States is remarkably similar to South Korea, right? Like, nothing proven there. And lastly, as we explained, there are just far more people to sell to in China. It just does not make much sense. Secondly, we explained on this issue that if their claim is about hitback, China is a far more dangerous partner to try and hit back at you because, firstly, they are far closer and they have far fewer checks and balances. Like, tariffs on their side exist for 3 years of this administration as they can see that they're going to go away. China has the ability to impose them for good. This is where claims about things like the South China Sea hurt them, because trading with China is exactly what gives you protection in those industries, because South Korea or China wants you to trade in that region. They're not going to stop boats that are selling things to their consumers. And no, lastly, the way they respond to us, they say the Democrats will be fine, we'll come back and things will be fine. This hurts them because it means that their arm around tariffs go away. But even discarding that, they ignore all of the security benefits we present at First Affirmative to no response. Even if you think these deals are comparatively good, we give you far more there. Lastly, in terms of the political clash, the problem is we set up at First Affirmative to no response. The DPK has already rallied for this. Their Prime Minister literally worked in China for 30 years and people vote on that anyway. They do not explain why it's harmful. Even if you believe all of their case, the upshot is just South Koreans get a better deal and a good life. Their politicians have campaigned on it. It seems like they probably would.